The Russian Federation's Caspian flotilla was struck early this morning, not in Sevastopol, not in Novorossiysk, not in any of the ports Ukraine had already demonstrated the capacity to reach over the past 3 years of war, but in Astrakhan, nearly 1,000 miles from the front lines, in waters that Moscow had treated as an absolute strategic sanctuary since the very first day of the invasion. According to reports compiled by military monitoring channels and Ukrainian sources in the early hours following the attack, at least 2 Caliber cruise missile launching vessels were hit while docked, and a third suffered structural damage that immediately took it out of operation. Nearly 1,000 miles, roughly the distance between New York and Miami, covered by a swarm of long-range drones that, according to initial assessments by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, were likely advanced variants of domestically developed attack systems produced by the Ukrainian defense industry at an estimated cost of under $50,000 per unit. For comparison, each Buyan-M-class corvette docked at that port carried a Caliber missile launch system valued at over $200 million, meaning the cost ratio between the attacker and the target had exceeded 1 to 4,000. The equation had shifted, and it had shifted in a way the Kremlin could not reverse with rhetoric. Since 2022, when the first Caliber missiles launched from corvettes in the Caspian struck Ukrainian energy infrastructure thousands of miles away, the Caspian flotilla had operated under a premise that seemed militarily unassailable. Geography protected it. The Caspian Sea is an enclosed lake with no connection to any ocean, entirely surrounded by Russian, Kazakh, Turkmen, Iranian, and Azerbaijani territory. None of these countries were belligerents. No publicly known Ukrainian weapon had the range to cross the entirety of southern Russia and strike those waters. In Russian operational doctrine, the Caspian flotilla was the perfect rear guard, a point from which one could attack without ever being attacked. And it was precisely this premise that disintegrated this morning. But the true impact of this operation went far beyond battlefield numbers. To understand what today's attack represented in the broader architecture of the war, one must look back at the role the Caspian flotilla played in Russia's campaign of energy terror against Ukraine. Since the fall of 2022, Buyan-M-class corvettes and Gepard-class frigates have fired hundreds of Caliber missiles from the Caspian at Ukrainian power plants, transformer substations, and heating grids, civilian targets that left millions of people without light or heat for 2 consecutive winters. The Caspian was the safest launch platform Russia possessed, too far away to be hit, yet close enough for the missiles to traverse Russian airspace and reach Ukraine with fuel to spare. According to British Ministry of Defense estimates, roughly 30% of all calibers fired at Ukraine in the first 2 years of the war originated from vessels stationed in the Caspian. Nearly a third of the entire cruise missile campaign came from that Lake Moscow considered invulnerable. And here was the paradox the Kremlin planners had failed to calculate. By concentrating launch capacity in the Caspian precisely because they considered it out of reach, Russia created the most valuable and poorly defended target of the entire war. The anti-aircraft defenses in Astrakhan were scaled to protect port infrastructure against conventional threats, not against coordinated swarms of low-flying, long-range attack drones navigating corridors that no long-range radar covered with adequate density. Every ship clustered in that port simultaneously represented a concentration of strategic firepower and a catastrophic vulnerability. The weapon Russia had positioned there to strike Ukraine without risk had become, in practice, the most generous offering Moscow could have made to Ukrainian military intelligence. And the greatest paradox of the whole crisis was right here. The weapon the regime had deployed to hurt the enemy was, at that very moment, destroying its own source of strategic projection. Step back for a moment and look at the big picture. The destruction or incapacitation of at least 2 Caliber launch platforms in the Caspian didn't just mean fewer missiles fired at Ukrainian cities in the next attack cycle. It meant Russia was losing the ability to mount coordinated salvos, those massive strikes where dozens of calibers were fired simultaneously from multiple directions to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. The Russian Navy had already lost the cruiser Moskva in 2022 and had been forced to withdraw virtually the entire Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol throughout 2023 and 2024, pushing ships toward Novorossiysk and into the Caspian itself. Now the Caspian had also been breached. The list of safe harbors was shrinking, and replacement costs were prohibitive. Each Bayern M corvette took 3 to 4 years to build in Russian shipyards at a cost that, according to estimates by the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, exceeded $250 million per unit under normal conditions and could be significantly higher under the sanctions regime restricting Russian access to Western electronic components. The plan had failed. In a moment, you'll understand why a specific detail about the drone's flight path completely changes the strategic nature of this analysis. But first, there was a human dimension that anchored the meaning of that attack in something far more concrete than naval statistics. Rear Admiral Alexander Preston, commander of the Caspian flotilla since 2024, a veteran of the Syrian campaign, and one of the officers who personally oversaw the first caliber launches against Aleppo in 2015, was reportedly among the commanders hurriedly evacuated from the port facilities during the strike, according to unconfirmed accounts from Russian military channels on Telegram. Preston is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the investigative coordinate of what the Russian doctrine of geographical sanctuary consumed, the assumption that certain positions were beyond enemy reach, and that this assumption precluded the need for proportional investment in defense. And so we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. How did Ukraine reach Astrakhan? The distance of nearly 1,000 miles required a strike system with range, navigation, and evasive capabilities that until a few months ago were not part of the publicly known inventory of Ukrainian forces. According to preliminary analyses published in the hours immediately following the strike, the drones had followed a flight path that bypassed the main belts of Russian air defense, flying through low-altitude corridors over regions of southern Russia where radar coverage was fragmented, taking advantage of a fact Western analysts had been warning about for months. Russia had redeployed a significant proportion of its S-300 and S-400 air defense systems from rear areas to zones closer to the front lines in Ukraine and to protect Moscow, leaving vast corridors of the Russian interior with degraded coverage. And here is what that detail about the route changed. The strike on the Caspian didn't just reveal that Ukraine had long-range drones, it revealed that Russia had holes in its air defense of such massive proportions that virtually any strategic asset positioned in the deep rear was left vulnerable. In the shadow of this monumental strategic blunder, one actor was watching everything with calculated satisfaction. And here was the player. The headlines weren't mentioning as frequently as the data warranted: China. Beijing was monitoring the performance of Russian anti-aircraft defenses with an interest that went far beyond diplomatic solidarity. Every failure of the integrated Russian air defense system provided Chinese military intelligence with invaluable operational data regarding the true limitations of the S-400 systems, the exact same systems China had purchased from Russia and positioned around the Taiwan Strait. If swarms of $50,000 Ukrainian drones could penetrate nearly 1,000 miles of Russian airspace without being intercepted, what did that say about the actual capability of those systems against the American cruise missiles that would be deployed in a potential Pacific conflict? The data was devastating, and Beijing didn't need a single spy to acquire it. The war in Ukraine had become the largest air defense testing laboratory in modern history, and the results were being broadcast in real time. The historical analogy that most accurately captures this dynamic isn't the destruction of the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, though the temptation to draw that comparison is understandable. It is the Israeli strike on the Egyptian air bases in 1967, when the Israeli Air Force destroyed the majority of the Egyptian aviation fleet on the ground, not because they possessed overwhelming air superiority, but because they recognized that the Egyptians had concentrated their assets in bases they deemed out of range and had invested in defenses proportionate to that flawed assumption. The core principle was the same. The premise of geographical invulnerability produced concentration, and concentration without proportional defense produced catastrophe. In '67, Egypt lost 381 aircraft in less than 3 hours. In the Caspian, the scale was smaller. but the structural logic was identical. But there was another layer we hadn't touched on yet, and it completely alters the nature of this analysis. The economic dimension of the strike went beyond the replacement cost of the ships. Russia used the port of Astrakhan not merely as a naval base, but as a logistical hub for the north-south transport corridor connecting Russia to India and Iran via the Caspian, a trade route Moscow had been aggressively promoting as an alternative to maritime routes controlled by Western powers. According to data from the Russian Ministry of Transport, the volume of cargo moving through the port of Astrakhan had grown by 42% between 2022 and 2025, driven by sanctions that forced Russia to seek alternative avenues for its exports. A port under attack was a port where insurance premiums skyrocketed, where logistics operators hesitated, where trade partners recalibrated. And here is what that layer revealed. The Ukrainian strike didn't just hit Russian naval capacity, it struck a commercial artery the Kremlin had built specifically to bypass Western economic pressure. Every drone that reached Astrakhan carried a dual message: military and economic. Russia cannot sustain this bleeding indefinitely, and the end of this phase will determine the future not of a single country, but of all of Europe. What early this morning proved was that the concept of a safe rearguard no longer exists in this war. The entirety of Russian space, from Belgorod to the Caspian, had become an operational zone for Ukrainian forces. The question that no defense cabinet in Moscow, Washington, or Beijing will be able to avoid in the coming weeks is direct and specific. If Ukraine can hit the Caspian, what else is within reach? Refineries on the Volga, ammunition depots in the Urals, the pipeline infrastructure that feeds Russian exports to China. The answer to that question will redraw the boundaries of this war before the year is out, and that redrawing has already begun. If this topic revealed something you hadn't considered before, share this video with someone following the conflict. The analysis that started here is exactly the kind of conversation that needs to reach more people before the next chapter writes itself.